So thank you, Dr. Carter, for that excellent introduction. And good evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight. So to kind of reiterate what Dr. Porter was just saying, tonight I'm going to be talking about the effects of the internet and social media in Jordan. And I'm going to begin with an introduction to the major players in Jordan's online media industry before presenting some examples of how these tools change what people can and can't do. So I'm going to talk about changes in Jordan's laws around the internet, but I'm going to be arguing here for the importance of informal social norms in understanding what's going on. And as a result of this focus on informal social norms, you're going to hear a lot of different opinions in this lecture about Jordan, free expression, and the government. Okay? And of course, as a result also of all this, there's going to be some talk about conflicts and violence that have occurred. And I want to emphasize, of course, that Jordan is a country of safety and security. We all say, and I think that that's very true. And these events that I'm going to be describing are not the norm, but that's exactly, I think, what makes them important for us to understand and think about, especially from a scientific perspective. And I also want you to keep in mind that as I'm describing conflicts and violence, that I'm not trying to make an argument about how Jordan should run its affairs, because I think that this is a matter best left to Jordanians to decide on their own. Rather, my goal in this lecture is going to be to understand how things work in Jordan. And I think the most important thing, and this is again echoing what Dr. Porter just said, is that please don't assume that I agree with the opinions that the various Jordanians you'll hear in this lecture kind of articulate. And I think indeed you're going to hear a range of diverse opinions in this lecture that reflect the diversity of opinion in Jordan itself. So that's a kind of an opening disclaimer there. So to begin, the media landscape of the Middle East has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. When I first came to the region in 2004, satellite TV was being celebrated as transformational. By the time I first visited Jordan in 2006, rural communities were enjoying unprecedented access to the wider world. In the realm of news, platforms like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya offered alternatives to various state television stations and the major state-supported newspapers in Jordan like Al Rai and Al Dastur. Yet satellite TV, while introducing a diversity of editorial lines, was primarily outward-facing. The very names of the major players like Al Jazeera or the Peninsula and Al Arabiya reflected the dream of building a pan-Arab public catering to the hundreds of millions of viewers. In commercial and political terms, the Arab states behind these channels, like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, were thinking on a grand scale. These were projects attempting to build unprecedented advertising markets and unprecedented tools for manipulating public opinion, the likes of which had never been seen before. Few would have predicted that a mere 5 years later, internet-enabled smartphones would play a role in yet another major information revolution. This took a number of forms, the first of which was the so-called Arab Spring, at least I think the most well-known and widely discussed. But the transformation happened more subtly. Beginning in 2007, when many of Jordan's major online tabloids began their operations. Sites like Amal News, Khabarni, and Saraya, and the more recent Al-Wakil al-Akhbari, now boast over 1 million plus followers on Facebook each. They specialize in local news on the model of American TV, where if it bleeds, it leads, as the saying goes. The reports are dominated by crime stories, car accidents, and to a lesser extent, celebrity gossip. Most see themselves as groundbreaking pioneers, although veterans of print media correctly point out that there are strong continuities between their operations and the Sahafa Safra, or yellow journalism, of the 1990s, when publications like Ash-Shahid and Al-Mirah enthusiastically pursued lurid crime stories and allegations of official corruption. Yet the penetration of online news sites and their integration with social media represents something fundamentally new, I would argue. With their audiences in the millions, including both Facebook followers and those who see their stories when their friends like or share them, online news sites enjoy a circulation that print media could never have dreamed of. While Jordan's urban areas have always boasted a well-developed literate culture, social media and online news sites are bringing that culture to rural areas in unprecedented ways. Because online news sites are free and ready to hand through the use of smartphones, shepherds, farmers, and laborers can while away their days reading in ways they simply could not in the past. More importantly, Online commenting increases the interactivity of such media as never before, calling for a reaction from the reader. The experience of debating the issues of the day in writing with faceless strangers in an online environment represents a new mode of subjectivation for millions of working-class Jordanians. By subjectivation, I mean that these social media users become subjects of politics, history, and media, who then see themselves and their relationships to their societies in new ways. I would go so far as to argue that we are currently witnessing a golden age of literacy in rural and working-class communities across Jordan. Today, Jordan's online media landscape boasts a mix of extreme diversity amidst the consolidation of a few major players. Al-Wakil al-Akhbari sits at the top of the heap, I would argue, relying on the popularity of its namesake Muhammad al-Wakil, and his 7.5 million Facebook followers for his personal Facebook page. That's almost as many people as live in Jordan. This drives traffic to a more modest page called Wakil al-Akhbari, which has 1.5 million views and serves as the sort of the clearinghouse for the stories that he publicizes. There's also Rawaya, Jordan's top satellite TV channel, with 4 million followers. Then there's Al-Ghad, one of the major newspapers that has successfully made the transition to the internet, with 2.2 million followers. And then filling out the top tier are Khabarni, Saraya, and Amal News, with 2.1 million, 1.5 million, and 1.3 million, respectively. Beneath this second tier of websites with followerships in the hundreds of thousands, including Geoffrey News with 760,000, Soalif with 590,000, As-Sabil with 580,000, Heber with 310,000, Jarasa News with 230,000, and JO24 with 220,000. And this goes on and on and on. Beneath this lies a lot of smaller operations too numerous to keep track of, from upstart satellite TV channels like Wasat al-Balad, to government newspapers like Ad-Dastur, to one-man hobbyists drawing modest incomes from Google AdSense run out of their basements, or probably not their basements here. There are at least 200 online news sites in Jordan in total, and bankruptcies and new launches are a regular occurrence. Moreover, this list is not meant to be exhaustive, and Facebook followers are, of course, an imperfect measure of popularity. The editors of sites that don't rely on Facebook for traffic emphasize to me defensively that Facebook followers could be bought, which is certainly true. You can pay someone to increase your Facebook following. Rather, this is meant to give you a rough sense of the major players, who I mainly talk to, and who my friends in the industry saw as the major players and their main competitors. With the exception of the much better capitalized multi-platform operations like Al-Ghad, Rawaya, and As-Sabil, these online-only operations had staffs ranging from 10 to 20 and sought to make a profit or at least break even by selling advertising. There's an obvious dynamic that supports consolidation that I want to emphasize here. So the big sites could pay their staffs and even hire extra reporters to get more exclusive stories and beat their competitors to publish breaking news faster. Moreover, the bigger news sites became, the bigger their social media followings became, and the more interaction they could generate on social media in terms of likes, shares, and comments, thus driving even more traffic to the site. This in turn would increase advertising revenue that could be reinvested in the website to further increase the traffic. For major operations, this serves as a positive feedback loop, a virtuous cycle, if you will. But for the smaller sites, there's the opposite that would tend to happen. A shrinking audience will hurt advertising revenue, which in turn will make it harder to pay one's staff. A staff that isn't regularly paid will not work as hard, and to add insult to injury, as the quality of the site drops and the stories are increasingly derivative, there is little reason for people to interact with the website by liking, sharing, or commenting on its social media. The shrinking site enters a death spiral and eventually loses its ability to pay its licensing fees and the editor's required membership fees in the Jordan Press Syndicate. There is, however, a dynamic that can keep smaller sites afloat, which is their tendency to be more associated with oppositional politics. This is not to say that these sites are dissidents or ma'arudin. In fact, most Jordanians these days seem to cynically deny the very existence of an opposition in Jordan, often while being highly critical themselves of the current political situation. Yet the employees of sites like Jafra, As-Sabil, and As-Sawsana, Soalif, Heber, and JO24 tend to emphasize their independence and portray the ostensibly more successful competition as little more than pro-government stenographers. As-Sabil is sympathetic to the Islamic movement, While Geoffrey, Heba, Soulif, Sosana, and JO24 have tended to give more sympathetic coverage to the Hera or movements in recent years, JO24 was actually blocked for over a year because it refused to go along with the application of Jordan's press law to online news sites. An important but much more difficult to track phenomenon is that of personal Facebook pages and public and secret Facebook groups. While Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat and WhatsApp are all used in Jordan, everyone from youth to media professionals agree that Facebook is by far the most important for the dissemination of information, while Twitter is mostly used by famous people involved in politics. The other major social networking platforms are much more private by nature, and I won't be focusing on them here. Many of these standalone Facebook pages have a clearer political agenda than these news sites. There are a number of personal Facebook pages of important public personalities in Jordan with larger followings than many of these news sites. As I mentioned, the biggest name in Jordan is Facebook is by far Mohammed Wakil with 7.5 million likes. Among Islamists, Mohammed Nuh boasts over 900,000 likes, and Amjad Korsha boasts 592,000. The opposition figure Layth al-Shabilat has 580,000, and Yahya Saud, who recently shot to fame threatening to fight an Israeli member of Knesset, now has over 100,000 followers. Facebook groups represent another aspect of Jordan's changing media landscape. Many of these are private and readerships tend to be small because the larger ones are overwhelmed by the challenges of effective moderation, which means attracting unwanted advertising, bad social actors, and irrelevant posting. There are groups with different political persuasions, and some, like Al-Hamla al-Wataniya al-Muqata, have vast followings, like the National Campaign's 390,000 followers. Yet most are much smaller, like the Islamic Action Front's page with 10,000 followers, and the Tribes of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan with 14,000 followers. Many tribes also have pages of sizable but more focused Facebook followings, like Kabilat al-Shwaitat page with 90,000 followers, and my favorite Facebook group name, the biggest gathering of the Arab tribe, the Ta'amuri in Jordan and Palestine, with 15,000 followers. There are also local sites with clear tribal take on the news, like Mwaka from the Heart of Events, which tends to report on current events to its 80,000 followers from a Beni Sakhr perspective, reflecting its local allegiances being from the town of Mwaka. These personal and groups Facebook pages benefit from but are limited by the nature of the medium. Currently, they are not covered by Jordan's press law and are hence much cheaper to run, because they do not require licensing and dues payments in the Jordanian press syndicate. Moreover, they are difficult to block without interfering with a lot of legitimate Facebook activity that would upset everyday citizens and even the government's own information operations. The only effective way to shut them down is to undertake the difficult task of actually tracking down these page administrators. There is a move to apply the electronic crimes law and even laws around journalism to these pages, but these efforts too are hampered by the practical difficulty of monitoring activity on Facebook and holding often anonymous individuals responsible for their behavior. The same activities that allow these pages to slip under the government's radar and make it difficult for me to study them systematically also make them poor substitutes for the website format that has attracted regulatory attention so far. Most importantly, it's hard to know who's behind them and where they are. They are difficult to search, information disappears quickly into newsfeed history as new stories are added on top, and privacy permissions and circles of trust are easier to apply in the closed-off world of Facebook. All of these factors make personal Facebook pages and Facebook groups important, but distinct from the online news sites that use Facebook more as a means of distribution than a hosting platform. In fact, these Facebook pages themselves tend to rely on the online news sites to legitimate their claims about current events, thus further increasing the reach of online news sites and making them more central to contemporary political discourse in Jordan. Of course, to come back to this model that I've been showing you, the news business is never a straightforward money-making operation. The ability to influence public opinion is often the primary objective, and making money is simply a means to an end. Some of these sites, like Heba, openly take funding from foreign sources, and other sites are more widely believed to do so. Many well-connected Jordanians believe that at least some of these sites make money blackmailing the corrupt, or merely those who might appear to be corrupt. The most successful sites are often believed by their less successful counterparts in the news business to be extensions of Jordan's intelligence services. While some of this talk is probably exaggerated, Most of the journalists everywhere in the world work closely with the security services, so, as we will see, the idea of cooperation between the security services and the media isn't something that comes about from people's imagination as journalists, but rather from their everyday experience tracking the news. After all, when a crime or accident or natural disaster happens, the best source of information is usually the government itself, and specifically the police. I have also had a number of journalists show me how press releases from the Public Security Directorate are often shamelessly copy-pasted to the site to save time and generate free content without having to fear any sort of negative consequences that might come from getting the story wrong. Sure enough, the same verbatim articles show up on their competitors' sites. And this is not because of a conspiracy, but simply because it is easy, given that everyone agrees that it is, even if everyone agrees it is unprofessional. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that media can only work if people look at it, and so commercial, extortionist, and propagandistic agendas all depend on convincing people to provide their precious attention. Winning people's attention, in turn, requires appealing to their desires and mirroring their pre-existing beliefs. This makes media, whatever is one's agenda, an inherently compromised project that is often more constrained in what it can do than outsiders tend to appreciate. As we will see, if media often seems to rule the world from the perspective of outsiders, that is only because the most successful media professionals have learned how to submit themselves to the exacting requirements of their demanding audiences and the broader political context. Otherwise, people change the channel, choose another site, or perhaps they just turn it all off and go talk to their neighbors. So, at this point I'm going to switch from a rather dry kind of overview of the industry. I'm going to look at some actual cases, what people do in Jordan with the media, what the media can do, what it prevents you from doing. I've spent about 4 years of my life up to now living and working in Jordan. Most of what you will hear in this section, though, will be based on about 6 months of dedicated field work in Jordan, plus years of following these sites online. During field work, I conducted over 50 formal interviews with journalists, intellectuals, community leaders, and members of the security apparatus. This included interviews with someone from almost every major online news site, almost always a senior editor or veteran reporter. I also attended community gatherings, award ceremonies for journalists, I observed newsrooms in action, and I spent countless hours in the cafe with journalists drinking tea and coffee, playing chess and chips, and speculating about the latest current events. Now, I want to emphasize here that I've avoided using the names of the people I talk to protect their privacy, right? So if you hear somebody's name and it's their real name, that means I don't know who they are, I have no insight into their motivations or who they are, they're merely a public figure. And in other cases, especially in the final example, I use one pseudonym, and I'll try to make very clear that that is a pseudonym. But in general, yes, just be very aware that, as I said, that these are not necessarily my opinions, and I'll try to say quote really loudly to differentiate between what I think and what other people think. And you'll hear a lot of contradictory opinions in what follows. And I want to show the diversity of opinions within Jordan, rather than trying to put forward a single correct answer. Although feel free to tell me what you think is the correct answer, I suppose, in the question and answer. So it's important to remember, as I said, right, that Jordan is a country of safety and security. Right? But as I said, we can learn a lot more as social scientists when we look at problems and when we look at normal everyday life, unfortunately. So these cases don't represent normal life. What they help us do is they help us understand in extremis dynamics that are otherwise happening beneath the surface that are more difficult to look at. The first case I'm going to talk about will be clashes between the Hoytat and the Mahani that happened while I was doing my dissertation research in 2012-2013. This is how I originally got interested in this topic. The second case I'm going to talk about is the Nahatatov case, which is a case of alleged blasphemy that happened during my research last summer and ended in the journalist being accused of insulting religion and his unfortunate death. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a controversy this summer involving the Lebanese rock band Mashua Leila, who were eventually banned from playing in the country. So again, these are not normal events. These are extraordinary events, which is precisely why I'm going to be looking at them. But I think they can teach us something about dynamics that are happening beneath the surface more generally. And therefore, they're sort of worth talking about in a sort of scientific context like we're here in today. So the first case I'm going to talk about is the Hoytat versus the Mahani. I conducted fieldwork in rural Jordan in the summer of 2010, and then from May of 2011 to October of 2012. This came after the collapse of regimes in Tunisia and Egypt and major protests across the region. In Jordan, this was a time of protests as well, including large strikes among public sector employees and protests over taxes and subsidies. Yet with the exception of the teachers' strike, one of the biggest events of that time from the perspective of the Hoitat who I lived with was a major feud with the Mani, who continued a much older rivalry but magnified and intensified the conflict through the power of new media. In contrast to the self-congratulatory coverage of events of social media that were common in the West at the time and that attempted to take credit for the Arab Spring by attributing it to Western technology, this conflict showed a darker side of the internet. What I came to realize was how the internet, rather than supporting free expression, the civil state, and the rule of law, could actually undermine these things. This is when I began paying attention to the social media in Jordan as never before. I want to emphasize that plenty of social media activity, and activity in general in Jordan, has nothing to do with feuding and tribalism, especially in urban areas. Jordanian social media users love sharing jokes, poetry, inspirational images, and a lot of Islamic and nationalist content. They also take vast quantities of pictures of themselves, their friends, and their mundane daily activities, especially food. People seem to like pictures of food everywhere in the world. I certainly love pictures of food, actually, on the internet. People seem to, but the nature of pre-existing rural Jordanian social networks also tends to make kinship integral to the process of adopting new media. So for instance, because most mobile phone companies in the early days of mobile phone adoption used to offer discounts to calls within their networks, kin would often pressure each other to switch carriers to save them money. And this actually led to different carriers being associated with different tribes in some areas, especially amongst people who are inclined to think in those terms. Likewise, when it comes to them to friend or follow people on social media and share content with these people that they'll like, it's often one's tribe that one's turned to for connections as well as affirmative, non-controversial material that can be unproblematically liked and shared. The semiotics of such circulating images proclaiming tribal solidarity tend to revolve around connecting the name of one's tribe with other prestige symbols, including international brands, nationalistic symbols like flags, and traditional Bedouin regalia and paraphernalia. But the full potential of this combination of kinship and social media first struck me during the clashes that broke out between the Hoitat and the Mani in 2012. There had been talk of a shooting at Hussein bin Talal University, of people being pulled off buses, having their IDs checked, and being attacked on the basis of their last name. These sinister rumors became far more concrete when a group of Sharia court employees in Manava that I was working with, none of whom were from either family, began repeatedly watching a viral video that was being shared around Facebook that purported to show the corpses of two Manis who had supposedly been killed by the Hoitat. Debate raged as the video was played and replayed. Was it real or fake? Hakiki or kidab? Were the corpses who they were purported to be? Most importantly, just what sort of agenda was pursuing this video and the conflict more broadly? Was this being disseminated by the Hoitat as a means of gloating, or by the Manis to rile up their kinsmen for another round of revenge? Might there be darker forces at work? Israel, the US, or Adola, the state, driving all of this to sow chaos in Jordan amidst the tumult of the Arab Spring? Yet as events progressed, it became less about the rival families and more about showing off to one's extended kin network. A particularly striking post depicted four men with keffiyehs covering their faces, holding a stolen Ministry of the Interior sign and assault rifles. Comments included, "There's no correct solution but the correct one from long ago, which is for the southern desert to be independent from the rest of the governorate," and "The Hoitat are an army that doesn't need training." Whatever dark forces did or did not lie behind the clashes, the young people disseminating such pictures on social media were enjoying themselves immensely as they defined themselves in opposition to historic rivals and challenged authority figures in their family and on a national stage. It turned out that Manis had in fact been killed, and that this was all proceeding far outside of the formal channels through which such conflicts were supposed to proceed. Elder members of the community were complaining that people were being attacked with little in the way of genealogical precision. The victims were not from the Khamsata down, the group of relatives of the criminal to the fifth generation, who can legitimately be attacked following a murder under the traditional tribal law. In any event, the government had announced a truce, and important men from both families had backed it. What was clear, though, was that at least some people were enjoying the opportunity to incite chaos and undermine authority figures. One interesting dimension that I want to highlight in this coverage was how the media slowly began to name the tribes involved. This represents a red line of sorts for almost all of the journalists I've spoken with. As one explained, we don't want to fight to widen, so for instance, if there's a clash in Ma'an, we don't want for people to read about it in Azarka and then start a fight there. As the violence progressed, though, this rationale began to break down. Everyone knew who was involved, and in any event, the names of the tribes were being widely discussed in the comment sections on Facebook and other social media. This began to exert a subtle but undeniable social pressure on various sides to reconcile as more people were inconvenienced by the ongoing violence and blamed the tribes for the violence more than the government. It was relatively unsurprising then to see the Jordanian government quickly step in. In the short term, there was an attempt, following the logic of practices of tribal atwa or truce and practices of jelba or banishment, to blockade the traditional domains of their respective families and keep them apart. Yet this led inexorably towards more protests, media following along naturally and documenting the whole thing, in a process that dragged on into the following year. With the 2011 Arab Spring and its internet-mediated dimensions as a backdrop, 2012 was also the year that the Jordanian government began applying the press and publications law to the internet, requiring websites to be registered with the government and have a full-time editor with at least 4 years of membership in the Jordanian Press Association. As the liberal website Hebrew noted, this followed, quote, a concerted media effort to portray the internet as a lawless badlands where crime goes unpublished and the state is powerless to protect victims, unquote. Yet, the website noted caustically, quote, from the police no-go zone of Al-Luban to the southern city of Ma'an, where the state has stopped sending traffic police after a series of armed clashes between citizens and policemen, it is telling that there is one particular space that the government insists must be kept under control of stringent legislation, the internet. But against this move to separate tribal spaces in places like Ma'an, in which supposedly illegitimate political contestation predominates, from online spaces, presumably home to more legitimate modes of political contestation, I want to emphasize that the two are not so easily separated. What are at stake in both are various sovereign prerogatives that compete in an increasingly global system made up of responsibilized guardians of social order. In fact, journalists themselves are increasingly under pressure to mediate conflicts in ways that are reminiscent of tribal notable rules before them. They are monitored by the government, but also by the general population. Unlike people inciting the mob from behind anonymous social media accounts, they have much less ability to hide. Here, I turn to another high-profile case that I've explored in my research, the murder of the journalist Nahid Hattab in the fall of 2016. The dominant political debates in 2016 that ran through my conversations with journalists had become almost exclusively concerned with the question of what people could legitimately articulate online. Chief among the controversies that summer were a string of high-profile cases in which Islamists were arrested and accused of interfering with Jordanian foreign policy through social media by publicly criticizing its American and Gulf allies, including the Zaki bin al-Rashid case and the Amjad Korsha case. Then, amidst this crackdown on Islamists, there was the arrest of a Christian journalist named Nahid Hattab for an allegedly blasphemous anti-Daesh Facebook post that would soon lead to his assassination on the courthouse steps. Nahid Hattab had been a prominent figure in the wave of strikes and popular mobilizations that hit Jordan in 2010 to 2012. As the political scientist Tariq Tel wrote in 2015 in The Revolt of the Military Veterans, quote, thanks to the efforts of Al-Arab al-Yom newspaper columnist Nahid Hattab, the NCRS, and this is the National Committee of Retired Servicemen, began to take an active interest in public sector worker struggles in late April 2010. Influenced by Hattab and like-minded Transjordanian radicals, the sloganeering of the teachers' committees in Al-Karak and Al-Salt took on an increasingly nationalist coloring. The more radical members of the military veterans movement and the leaders of the Al-Salt and Al-Karak Teachers Committee joined with Hattab and other East Bank activists to launch the Progressive Jordanian Tendency. In effect, this formalized the grouping that had coordinated and publicized the popular upsurge accompanying the May 1st Retired Servicemen's Manifesto. Yet Hattab's downfall would not come as a result of his work with the retired servicemen, the teachers' union, or the Progressive Jordanian Tendency, at least not directly. Hattab's problems began rather with a simple Facebook post, one that was not even his own but was simply reshared. The post in question consisted of a satirical cartoon he shared that imagined an Islamic State god, who's obviously not pictured here, but you can see the context and why this would be so inflammatory, who is plying a jihadist in heaven with fruit, wine, and multiple women. Rather than being taken as a denunciation of Jordan's sworn enemies to the north, though, who are of course regularly repudiated by most people in Jordan that I've come across as perverting Islam, the most widely read way of looking at this was that this was a likely atheist member of a prominent Christian family thumbing his nose at popular religious beliefs. Opinions among journalists at the time were largely negative, and few took seriously the idea that the image was not meant as an image of the actual God. Right, that this was basically the idea of someone's perverse imagining of a god rather than an actual image of God. One reporter I talked to called him an unbelieving dog, as she engaged in a Facebook argument with someone who she faulted for defending Qatar, quote, when one of your colleagues in the Emirates sits in jail, unquote. Another told me more fatalistically, quote, no matter what the majority think of the system here, they will never accept the insulting of religion. They believe that insulting religion is bad, that it creates discord or fitna. Especially after the events, ahdath, the Arab Spring. People want stability, they want strength. They see how the United States manipulated freedom of expression to advance their agenda. Back then we could criticize anyone and anything. Now there are so many red lines. You have to choose between freedom of expression and democracy here, unquote. Since his murder, opinions have become more ambivalent. Many journalists now see him as a fool, but nonetheless the victim of a vicious smear campaign of demonization. He has become a stand-in for the way journalists must fear not just the wrath of the government, but also the wrath of a networked mob violence. When I asked journalists to think about the role of the scapegoat, or kibish al-fidat, in online media, Hatter's name came up repeatedly. The circumstances surrounding Hatter's death are still subject of intense speculation. One journalist speculated, in particular, that this was mostly the fault of the governor of Oman for fueling the passions of the crowd. Quote, he declared Hatter an outlaw just because the police couldn't find him at home the night after he posted the cartoon on Facebook. Obviously that incited people, unquote. Another told me, quote, I was teaching a class about journalism, and one of the students who was in the military told me there's this military unit that's supposed to be super fancy, 4 floors underground. Their media response unit doesn't just monitor, they also influence. So they create videos and sponsor things, and it's nothing official. They just tried to create content and make it go viral. Anyway, the student was saying they played a big role in this, unquote. A friend of Hatter's, who was critical of his actions but saw more nefarious interests as responsible for his death, questioned the idea that his death was a result of the actions of a lone gunman, although he said we could never know for sure. When I asked what interests had benefited from his death, he said, quote, the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters in the state, they're the ones who benefited. You can analyze that however you want, unquote. To emphasize, and I want to be very clear here, right, that I have no idea if any of this speculation is true, much of it is contradictory, and I would not want to imply that any of these particular theories is widely accepted in Jordan. But what I want to say is that the style of reasoning that you see in these quotes is highly typical. The official channels for censorship are widely understood and often mocked. They say that there are the 3 Ds that can't be criticized, the Diwan, the Royal Court, the Da'irat, as in the offices of the military and the intelligence services, and Deen, or religion. And true to form, none of what is written or quoted should be seen as a criticism of any of these 3 Ds. These are beyond reproach, both among journalists I spoke with and, of course, in this lecture. My point is rather simply that what increasingly keeps journalists on their toes is a more subtle and diffuse form of retaliation that connects shadowy interests and inscrutable motives to popular movements and the threat of mob violence in the streets. All the same, though, and this is here I turn to my 3rd example, and final example, whatever chilling effect the killing of Nahat Hatter has had on journalism in Jordan, journalism still revolves, as it does in most places, around the necessity to find conflict. Without conflict, it's very hard to do journalism. Now, of course, most of the journalists I met, and this includes major news sites as well as more oppositional ones like As-Sabil, Sosana, love to report on khair, or good works in the community. And they like to do this. They're very proud of their work in this regard. But they also know that that's only a small part of their job, and that people want to hear about the bad news too. and I hope I've made the right calculation by giving you some bad news as well as some good news in this presentation. So journalists in Jordan continue to seek out conflict no matter how much there are limits imposed by the government and the public. Journalists are often quite happy to take on ministers, members of parliament, and other powerful people up to a point, as I'm sure you've all noticed from living here. Most journalists I spoke with were critical of how the media jumps from minor outrage to minor outrage from day to day, with it being difficult to remember what people were talking about 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago. This last case study in my presentation will focus on these minor outrages. It's the case in this example of the Lebanese rock band that wanted to perform in Jordan under the auspices of the Ministry of Tourism, the Roya Satellite TV channel, and other major sponsors. However, the band attracted controversy for a number of reasons. The fact that a number of the group was openly gay, their use of queer, gender-bending imagery, and their cynical and mocking attitude towards religion and nationalism. One reporter, who I'll call Ahmed, to disguise his identity, so again, there's not actually a reporter named Ahmed that you should be thinking about here, this is a pseudonym, took particular interest in the case. He was outraged at the idea of the Ministry of Tourism would promote homosexuality. And he saw more nefarious forces behind it as well, like Roya, a network that he believed to be financed by a shadowy interest, possibly embassies, USAID, or Western NGOs with liberal agendas. He said, quote, "I know their operations. Roya has 70 to 100 employees. Their advertising is just a cover. There's no way that they can pay for all that with that," unquote. As he pursued the story and it began to take off, hundreds of comments flooded the Facebook page of his news site. Other sites began to pick up the story too. Almost all of the comments seemed to reflect a disapproving attitude about the event. One top comment with over 50 likes exclaimed, "Sitin Samhaya," as in the sandal you wear in the bathroom, for anyone who would organize such an event. Another top comment read, "God damn anyone who is with them." Such comments were met, as you can, even if you can't read Arabic, you can see the approval that this negative comment received in terms of the emojis. But others within the more closed world of journalism were concerned. One person replied to an article Ahmed had posted on his personal Facebook page, saying, "Watch out, friend. This isn't the way to solve the matter. I mean, with this kind of article, maybe the outcome will be like what happened with Nahakata. Let's be relaxed a little bit. At the end of the day, a music party isn't going to affect anything, and in all certainty, it wouldn't affect anything even if it was a conference of homosexuals convening in Amman and the US ambassador himself attended." Ahmed shot back, "I hope the party won't happen for one reason, and that is to avoid what had happened to my dear friend Nahakata." Another commented, "Have mercy on me, Ahmed. You who are putting out the report. By God, how do you know that they're devil worshippers and homosexuals and a million things?" To this Ahmed replied, "Who said anything about devil worshippers?" His friend replied with a screenshot of someone who had shared one of his stories accusing the government of hypocrisy for shutting down, quote, "a Ramadan iftar for memorizers of the Quran and Ruseifa," unquote, while allowing, quote, "a party of sodomites and queers under the protection of the security apparatus." The post included hashtags, wake up village, cowardly government, Masonic fingers have changed methods, and Zionists of Jordan. By the evening, the Minister of the Interior had stepped in, overruled the Minister of Tourism, and canceled the event due to public security concerns. Ahmed celebrated on Facebook and was jubilant that evening at the coffee shop when we met. When he got a phone call from a TV station asking about the affair, he said, quote, "Yes, it started with a call from my editor-in-chief, who is a member of the Jordanian Press Syndicate, about an event called the Layla Project for the end of the month. This Layla Project, was supposed to promote homosexuality and perversion and was supported by the Ministry of Tourism and the Roya Television. Of course, I wanted to know more about this, so I talked to members of parliament who were concerned and did my own research online. Through this research, I learned that the government had banned the group the year before. I learned that the group was formed in a workshop at the American University of Beirut in 2008. Some of the imagery in their videos and promotions included men kissing, men in dresses, and other things that are counter to the conservative and tribal customs of the Jordanian people. So I wrote an article about this and published it, and there was a big popular response. People were outraged by this. Thanks to all the popular pressure, the Minister of the Interior has now banned the concert. This will protect the morals of the people from the corruption at the hands of this project, this Layla project. When he sat back down, we resumed our conversation on the media sector in Jordan. I told him that I was interested to pick up the story of media in the Middle East post-Arab Spring. I noted that there was a brief moment when the internet existed and the decision makers didn't understand it. News sites proliferated, and then there were revolutions and governments cracked down across the region. But I wondered, what happened next? Was there more press freedom or less now than in, say, 2001? Ahmed compared it to a man in handcuffs. At first, his wrists were bound together. He struggles and struggles, and slowly he finds he can separate his wrists. Then the guard comes and says, "What are you doing?" This is the Arab Spring. He said he had less freedom now than before the Arab Spring because now he is required to register with the press syndicate and pay membership fees. The government reads what he writes, and he can go to prison. He said, quote, "The biggest files in this country cannot be opened because the people behind them are too big," unquote. Here, he related his frustrations with the far more consequential story that he would have been unable to fully cover, the so-called spoiled chicken file, or Dajjaj Fasid. As it was widely reported throughout the Jordanian media during Ramadan, there has been a major problem with the chicken in Jordan's food supply in recent months. Safety controls have been ignored, and thousands of pounds of chicken have been found to be spoiled or corrupted. Here, corruption in its moral, political, and biological dimensions merge together in ways that threaten the safety and health of the body politic. And yet, when he went to the parliament to report on the meeting of the health committee examining the matter, he and his colleagues were thrown out of the meeting without explanation. Such is what happens when one takes aim at those who are too high up, he reasons. He said that you have to aim for the middle if you want to survive in this business. Overthrowing the system is out of the question. Quote, "I just want to breathe a little," he kept repeating. As you can see from the spirited debate between Ahmed and his friends and colleagues, there is plenty of debate about journalistic ethics in Jordan and what counts as a legitimate news story. There are widespread fears of inciting violence against the innocent, and there is also a pervasive sense of outrage about injustice. This leads to a belief among all of the journalists I talk to that the job of the journalist is to serve the citizen rather than the state. Some of this talk may not be sincere, of course, but plenty of it clearly is. We can, of course, debate what exactly the citizen is here and what citizens actually benefit from particular stories. But this is the style of debate among Jordanian journalists, the terms in which they argue with one another, and the terms in which they gain prestige in relationship to other journalists and other journalistic operations. Finally, I think it should be clear that whatever the limits to press freedom in Jordan, Jordanian journalists work to push the boundaries however they can, usually with somewhat good intentions, and the same sort of self-criticism that the man I've called Ahmed in this previous vignette showed for the limits of what they can actually do and how useful their work can actually be. One of the biggest challenges, and I'm going to conclude now, so these are concluding thoughts. So one of the biggest challenges for a social theorist like me working with journalists is that our methods and interests are so closely intertwined that it can be difficult to get theoretical purchase on their activities. After all, we both conduct interviews, we read, we observe, and we develop theories about political power, social change, and economic problems. The big difference is that where journalists are trained to look at the who, what, where, when, why of the story, that is important people, organizations, various meetings, social theorists like me are trained to look at more abstract social forces. In some ways, I think this is good because I will never have the level of insight into Jordanian newsmakers that my friends in the Jordanian media have. They have extensive sources, they live here every day, and they are extremely professional given the immense difficulties of operating under the conditions that they must face. If I can add something to the discussion, it will have to be more at the level of abstract systems and less at the level of detail. Here, I want to emphasize the image of a well-oiled propaganda apparatus with lavish funding and dedicated cadres of intelligence experts working night and day to construct an intricate pro-government narrative just doesn't match the data. Most journalists would probably agree, even if sometimes they suspect that their competitors are involved in such goings-on. Indeed, it is the very pervasiveness of the suspicions that journalists all have about each other that makes the notion that they are all collaborating in a self-conscious conspiracy to manipulate public opinion seem most implausible to me. These people are spread out throughout Oman, they rarely see each other, but they are in a competitive environment, they have plenty of time to imagine each other doing bad things. more common amongst journalists, I think, is a belief among journalists in shadowy networks that had illegitimately hijacked elements of the media and the state, including its security apparatus, its money, or even simply its prestige. These interests might be American, Zionist, Qatari, Muslim Brotherhood, or tribal mafia in origin. The concern of the journalists I came to know, all of whom portrayed themselves as ardent patriots, was that such activities would weaken the state, break its resolve, and sap it of its prestige. This in turn would leave the country more vulnerable to attack from dangerous external and internal forces. And so I don't want to discount the notion that there are forces working to weaken Jordan. I think if anyone would know who these people are and how they operate, it would be Jordan's journalists. Yet what I want to emphasize here, and this is going back to the idea of informal social norms that I started off this paper with and I've been trying to emphasize, is that there's a pervasive cynicism and suspicion that can sometimes be more powerful, I would argue, than the actual organized forces that people see attacking their country and weakening it. Sometimes where injustice does exist, it may be more efficient to rely on cynicism and fear than to actually go to the trouble of building up elaborate conspiracies. Let the free market and information and the imaginations of journalists and their readers fill in the gaps. And I do not say this out of criticism, but rather out of sympathy. For too long, Americans mocked the Middle East as a home to conspiracy theories, dictatorships, and censorship. This is in spite of the fact that many of the most pivotal events in modern Middle Eastern history have been conspiracies, from the Sykes-Picot Agreement to the invented rationale for the Second Iraq War. Yet increasingly, Americans themselves seem to be learning the style of thought that Jordanians have honed for decades, for better or worse. Senior members of the current administration believe themselves at war with a deep state, itself a term borrowed from Turkish politics. Meanwhile, the political opposition in America tends to believe it has been victim of a Russian electoral meddling operation. My advice to Americans in the audience would be to study the struggles of Jordanian citizens and journalists carefully because they are way ahead of you. My advice for the whole audience would be to follow the lead of social theorists and consider your politics not just in terms of political collections of shadowy interests, but also in terms of what the belief in such shadowy interests does to a country's politics. They're there and they're real, but perhaps simply identifying them and identifying the correct ones isn't the most effective response. Rather, there is a need to focus more on how average citizens, acting in the light of day, find their ability to build trust and cooperate restricted by beliefs about such shadowy interests in ways that actually increase the power of the spooks and the mafias and the foreign meddlers who we all know do in fact exist. Thank you very much.